Good evening, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. This is my friend Keshava, and he's going to do some chanting for us, as he always does, and then we'll go into our study course of Swami's books. You have enough room there?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. I should warn you before we start our internet. The little modem guy is right next to me, and we're going to give him lots of love because he has been spontaneously deciding that he doesn't want to serve us anymore, and we haven't been able to get the big modem doctor to come and look at it yet. So if it cuts out, hang in there for a minute or two because it has been just hiccuping and then coming back. However, if a long lapse happens, it's because we've lost our capacity to broadcast, and we'll see you next week. So wish us luck, and hopefully we'll just get through it without a problem. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, inspire us with your words, that we may feel not only the obvious meaning of what you say, but the deep consciousness of attunement with God that was behind every thought and every word. Help us to rise into the light, to leave behind us all our fears, all our delusions. Help us to live ever in your company, in constant attunement with God. Om. Peace. Amen. So now we'll have a little chanting and a brief meditation.
Om Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Govinda Jai Jai Gopal Jai Jai Radha Ramana Hare Govinda 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 Jai Jai.
We'll meditate now for a few minutes. Om, peace. Amen. For those who may have just joined us, we've been having a little trouble with our internet. Is the word modem still a word? Okay, I didn't know whether they still call the thing a modem. Anyway, it's been being a little temperamental. If we disappear, give us a minute and we should reappear. If a long period of time happens and we don't reappear, then we're gone for good, and we'll see you next week. But so far, it hiccups once or twice just to let us know who's boss, and then after that, it behaves. It's already hiccuped once, so let's see what happens. All right, friends. So now we are still in marriage and renunciation. We have 3 more letters to go in that section, and then we don't get a respite because the next section is called Strong Medicine, and indeed it is. So let's see what God has to say to us tonight. Swamiji has to say to us, the voice of God speaks through the letters of Swamiji. Let's see if it does. This is a very short letter that was written in 2006. Asked how to overcome a strong attachment to her son. Ultimately, you will have to release your son to God. He has only come through you. He has his own destiny to work out. It would be lovely if he could be on the spiritual path, but even that is his to work out. Yes, I will pray for you and also for him. In divine friendship, Swamiji. I've watched this. I've never borne children of my own in this lifetime. But of course, in the community, I have many godchildren, and I have watched and lived with, in companionship with many of my friends as they raise their children. Many of those little children are now full-grown adults with children of their own and way into their own destiny. It's only natural that parents want to give their children that which is most meaningful to them. And for those who are part of Ananda, who are deeply dedicated to the spiritual path, especially those who came on the path as adults and suffered a lot from the meaninglessness of the world, the overwhelming longing is to awaken one's own offspring to the source of true happiness. How could you not want that to be so? And especially when children are small, we have a certain amount of influence over them, but they very quickly begin to assert their own personalities and their own preferences. And so it's a cycle that every Ananda parent has to go through. In the Bhagavad Gita, I believe it's chapter 6, verse 42. It speaks of, Arjuna laments just before that. He says to Krishna, what happens if I renounce the world, I give up the happiness that this world has to offer me, I make every effort to realize God, but I don't realize God either. So I've sacrificed my worldly happiness and I haven't really attained divine happiness. I mean, it sounds to me like not a very good gamble, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what Arjuna says. And Krishna answers back. First he answers, this is the classic, my devotee is never lost. Meaning, I just because you don't attain God realization doesn't mean I turn my back on you. I am always with you, I am always guiding you. But then Krishna goes on to say that if you are deeply sincere in your spiritual effort, but still need more physical incarnations to become free, if you are very fortunate, you will be born into a household of yogis. You will be born into a household where spirituality will be yours from the beginning. And he says it's a very fortunate birth, and such births are very hard to come by. There are actually even translations of the Gita, because there are many translations. All this come from Sanskrit, and mine is, to say the very least, a very free paraphrase. But there's actually translations, Shivani found one that she shared with us, that says you'll be born into a community of yogis. Yeah, we were all really nice about that. So my friends that are now adults, that were born to my friends within the community, there's a number of people who I know well. I say that I knew you before you were born. I might have even known your parents before they were even with each other. I call them 642s because they were born into a household of yogis and grew up in this path, those who've come onto Ananda's path. And it's always actually was a matter of great interest to us. I remember speaking to one such child, 642, and I sort of said to her, you have to forgive me, but you have been sort of an experiment. You've been a little bit like a creature in a petri dish who just sort of watched to see sort of what will happen. Because Ananda was a brand new experiment. We had no idea. Here we are trying to be serious yogis, serious renunciates, but having families and having children, then raising children in this ashram environment. Like, what kind of souls will be drawn to us? What will be the result? And there is that comment in the Gita, who will come? For whom are these births appropriate? What kind of people? It's been very inconsistent. And I have to also say that essentially the first generation of children who were raised at Ananda, the community itself was more chaotic. And they didn't get as focused an upbringing as generations that have come after. We're about up to about the third generation of children that are growing up in the community. Now 50 years, that would be about right. And it's been just a huge variety. I think I might be overstating it, but I think without exception, the people who grew up at Ananda have been interesting, adventurous, solid human beings. There's been a few sad situations, situations in which, I have to be fair, I'm thinking about it, in which a person's life did not work out very well. That has, of course, happened. But there have also been a notable number of 642s, people who were born into the path, I'm trying to think, there's been one or two without exception where they were born, raised, and just consistently, without ever leaving, became dedicated. Most went on a loop of those who have come into Ananda. Most went on to a loop, went to college, maybe did some things after college, and eventually came back. I know a friend of mine whose son I knew before, long before he was born. When he took discipleship, his father just said to me, "I just feel done." He said, "I feel like I carried out the responsibility that was given to me by God, and now I can really give him over to God." Now, to say that means that my friend is detached from his son would be simply too much to ask. This relationship between parent and child, which in this life, as I said, I haven't experienced it, but I know it. I know it very well for many incarnations. We all do. It's too much to ask to be that detached. So what we have to work with, it's too much to ask of almost everyone, is what I would say. We just have to remind ourselves continuously. These children they have a full-grown destiny. Swamiji put it perfectly. He said, the father and the mother provide the physical vehicle for the soul to express its destiny. But the father and the mother create neither the soul nor the soul's destiny. And that's sort of the best way to say it. We have a responsibility. I had a little bit of involvement with my nephew when he was a child, enough to remind me of this whole cycle. We have a little bit of involvement. We can influence as best we can, and God knows we can pray continuously, unrelentingly. We can pray. But the soul has its own destiny. And I was talking to someone once who was feeling what I can only call as a parent, who was feeling an exaggerated sense of responsibility for the destiny of her child. And just to make it clear, I drew this little picture, and I can describe it to you because it was no great work of art. I grew like a rainbow, the shape of a rainbow. And I carefully, on my piece of paper, just with a pen, I drew rainbow after rainbow. I drew about 25 rainbows, and each was a line that went from the beginning to the end, and then there was another one right over it, then there was another one right over it. And so at the end, you end up with this 25 lines, each forming a rainbow, forming a thick rainbow. I said, okay, we've had millions of incarnations, and your son, your daughter, has had, let's just count the most recent 25 incarnations. They were born, they had a trajectory of adulthood, they grew into old age, and they died. And the parents' involvement in that life, now I'm thinking also in a very American way, where most of the time, by the time our children are 18, 20, they launch. We're not like Indian families or Chinese families or many even Italian families where children and parents stay together for a long time. In America, more likely, I left home at 18 to go to college, and I came back and lived with my parents for about 4 weeks. And after that, I think I've never spent more than 3 or 4 nights in my parents' house since then. I'm a bit extreme because I found my spiritual family, and the karma of my family was that they were to give me a wonderful upbringing so that I could go to my spiritual family. I remained loyal to them and attentive, but I never lived in their house again. So I was thinking like that. So here you have all this rainbow, birth to death, and you have the parents' influence right here. And then you have in every incarnation, you have the parents' influence, and it won't necessarily have been you each time. And when you look at the how much of the curve the parents are really responsible compared to how much of the life that person lives. And speaking to the mother or the father that I was talking to, maybe, I don't remember which it was, I knew their own life, and I knew how much their parents really determined their destiny, which was not very much. A similar situation to mine, well brought up, grateful, but the profound attunement as to what my life is really going to be about was not about my parents. And in this particular case, it was not about her parents either. I think it was a woman. It wasn't about her parents. When she herself thought about the influence that her parents had over her destiny, she had to observe that it was not very great. So what is the difference? I mean, many times I've had parents come to me as if they were wholly in charge of their child, but if they look at their own life, they see that their parents were never in charge of them. When I was 10, and of course I think I was an exception because I had this yogic destiny which was really driving me. But when I was 10, I fell in with bad company. And my sister tells me that indeed they were a bad influence on me, that I became rather a naughty person during that period of time. But I liked them because they were really interesting. They were much more interesting than the good girls. And my parents really didn't like it because they were sassy and they just weren't helpful. We were only 10, we weren't getting into horrible trouble, but they were sassy and not respectful. And in truth, I realized later that I think both of them had really troubled homes. I just didn't know that because such a thing would not have occurred to me. But in any case, there we were. And I remember standing up to my parents, and I was a runty little thing. I'm not, as an adult, I'm on the smaller side, and I was really on the small side growing up. So this runty little kid with this big mouth and this big brain, which is who I was, I remember literally folding my arms in front of my parents and saying, I said, "The die is cast," I declared. "I'm either a good kid or a bad kid, and there's nothing you can do about it now." Now, my parents were exceedingly good, so I'm sure they took me very seriously. But they must have laughed themselves silly after they got back to their bedroom. Can you imagine how comical that must have sounded? Just my little person declaring itself. But I remember it, and I have to say it now. It was true. It was absolutely true. And I knew that I was small and I was 10 and that there was going to be a number of years. I mean, I was still small enough for my daddy to pick me up and carry me around. He didn't usually, but he could when necessary. I was that little. And of course, I was little. I was 10. But I was completely my own person. And I absolutely knew I was. My parents could function around me. I could receive from them, and I respected them a lot. So I did receive a great deal from them. But the die was cast. Now, not all children are that self-aware. I was a yogi for many lifetimes. But it's still true. The die is cast. The die is cast from so many lifetimes. They're just passing through. They're just passing through. And we do our very best. Now I'm going to give you the other side of it. St. Augustine, very famous Catholic saint, the father of many of the teachings. He's a gigantic figure in the Catholic world. And he became a saint somewhat late in life. And he was quite a libertine. Actually, I don't know how old he was. I withdraw that comment. But he was quite a libertine. He was quite a worldly fellow in countless ways. Of course, he wrote his own, the Confessions of St. Augustine, which I've never read. I've only heard about. So he probably exaggerated his own badness. But nonetheless, he was a very worldly character. He even talks about, they used to have these violent performances at the Colosseum. Could it have been even people being gladiators and being ripped to death and really horrible things like that, but really horrible, bloodthirsty sports. And he talked about being entranced by that and the effort it took to withdraw his consciousness from it, which is just really startling. But he became a great saint. And his mother was also a saint. I believe her name was Saint Monica, if I'm not mistaken. And St. Augustine said, never underestimate the prayers of a devout mother. Because St. Monica never gave up on Augustine. And he credits her prayers with just inexorably drawing him to God. That it was his own worldly inclinations were powerless against the determination of his mother. Now, of course, his mother was a saint. She had a lot of power. But still, so my comment to all parents is, they have their own destiny. but they also have the incredibly good karma of having someone who loves God, and in the case of an Ananda person, who is a disciple of a great master, who also loves them. And Master's loyalty, I saw this in Swamiji, and Swami expressed the same in Master. Swamiji's loyalty to us automatically extended to those to whom we were loyal. It was one of the very touching aspects of his friendship for us. You know, if we had a relative or a friend who was important to us, even if they had nothing to do with Ananda, if Swami had the opportunity to serve them, you know, to greet them or to write to them or in some way to be of help to them, and absolutely to pray for them. You know, if you came to Swami with a heartfelt request for somebody that you loved, it was so touching to see how Swami would put himself forward, because his love for us extended to what was important to us. Just as Jesus said to his disciples, "You call me master, but I call you friend," because a friend embraces as his own the well-being and the interests of his friend. And that's how Swami was with us. We were his friends. So if my heart was breaking for my mother's illness or for my child's suffering, Swami's heart broke with me. And he would step in and help as much as he was able, because to all those who received him was the question. And if someone was not going to receive what he had to give, but never underestimate the power of a devotee to pray, even if it doesn't manifest in this life. Even if a person's life doesn't turn out that well, prayers can mitigate the karma. And very, very good devotees have had very difficult children. I mean, that's why when I was remembering through this, sometimes an individual has mixed karma. They have the karma to get a very devout parent, but perhaps not enough karma to really take the message in this lifetime. But it's registered. And if it doesn't fulfill itself now, it will fulfill itself later. I mean, what made all of us, I mean, there I was, born so strongly, drawn to truth and drawn so early in my life to it. I think that a lot of mothers and fathers had prayed for me in previous incarnations. It just takes a little time for us to catch up. So it all works out. It all works out in the end. And the more profoundly and deeply we can pray, let me think how to say it. What we really want is for a soul to fulfill its destiny. And it doesn't help our relationship. I'll tell you a story about a woman I know who might have even been the one to write this letter, for all I know. She could have. She was a single mother. She raised her son pretty much on her own. He's a full-grown man now and is a very fine person, extremely fine person, but not at all interested in our path, but a very, very honorable, a son to be proud of. And when he was small, she came onto the path when he was 6 or 7 years old. He was already, you know, a child. She became a devotee later in his life, in his elementary school years. Now let me think how to say this. Oh yes. So when she understood the spiritual path, one of the ways in which she prayed for her son is that she would do affirmations for him. She would find affirmations in Master's book, and she would do those affirmations, sort of projecting those positive thoughts into his mind. And it was a way for her to focus her prayers, you know. Whatever, I'm looking for the book, but I don't see one in front of me. But, you know, just, I am calm, I am courageous, the divine light shines within me, I move in the presence of God. Now that would be an affirmation that he would never choose for himself, but it would be an affirmation that she would choose for him. And he grew up very well, so I think it served her. And they had a very harmonious and a close relationship. When he began to be about 13 or 14, he suddenly became very rebellious with her, exceedingly rebellious, completely out of character for the way they had lived together for all the years before. Yes, of course, that age is often that rebellious, but she felt there was something more. And she intuitively understood that her effort to impose thoughts on him, she felt, he was feeling it and he resented it. He wanted to be his own person. He didn't want his mother planting attitudes in his mind. So she completely gave up the practice of doing those kinds of affirmations, which she'd been doing for years. And instead her prayer became, Divine Mother, he's your child. You know far better than I what he needs to do, where he needs to go. You know, you take care of him. Give me the grace to give him to you. She said almost immediately, harmony returned. Isn't that interesting? It's just like these ties are so much more complicated. I was just reading this morning in Guidepost magazine, which is this wonderful Christian publication that different people in my life give me subscriptions to every year. They have a companion thing called Mysterious Ways. It takes the place of Reader's Digest in my life. You know, it's wonderful, faith-based stories with happy endings, or at least with deep, inspiring parts of it, and I love it. Every time it comes, I just sit down and read it cover to cover. And today, I read this woman was talking about her near-death experience. A friend of hers who was 98 years old was on her deathbed, and she wanted the woman writing the story to tell her what heaven was like. So she starts in this story, and in this story, she describes that her husband's brother had recently died suddenly, and the husband and the brother had been very close, and the husband was very unhappy, just very, very grief-stricken. So their 20th anniversary came, and they decided they would go on a cruise. And she was, you know, just trying to buoy her husband up a bit because he was so grief-stricken over the loss of his brother. But like the first or second night out on the water, all she remembers is she felt dizzy, and then everything went black. And the next thing she knows, she has been, the ship has stopped in Key West, Florida. She's been airlifted to Miami, and she'd had a brain aneurysm, and there was a surgeon there who just happened to be an expert in what had happened to her. Next thing she knows, let me just think about this for a minute. Let me get this straight. If she's in the hospital, I believe she wakes up, and she sees her husband there, and her husband is, you know, he explains to her what's happened, and she sees how incredibly distraught he is. And everything seems fine, but then all of a sudden she leaves again. And this time she leaves consciously. This time she floats up to a beautiful pink cloud. And she talked about just how beautiful the pink cloud was. She talks about the music that she was hearing and just the wonderful angels and the extraordinary sense of peace. And this was the part that was so beautiful. She talked about everybody that she loved in the whole world, everybody that she loved. And she could tell that love was everlasting, and they would always be loved. It was just, she was just so free. And then it occurred to her to peek over the edge of the pink cloud. So she peeks over the edge of the pink cloud, and she's looking now at the hospital room. She's looking at her inert body. She's looking at the unbearable grief on the face of her husband. And she just realizes, I can't do this to him. It's just at first his brother and then me. I just can't do this to him. And bingo, she's back in her body. And she recovered and so on. Everything was fine after that, or at least enough to write this story. But it's like we don't have any idea what's going on. We live in this little world of you and me and him and her, and I'm this to you and you're this to me, and he lives and he dies, and she struggles and he succeeds. We don't have any idea what's going on. The only thing that is really true is our love for God and our love in God for each other, meaning the true selfless love that we have for one another. And you know, the sacrificial love of a mother and a father for their child is the most idealized, in an idealized sense, is the most selfless sacrificial love. I mean, I've never borne a child, but so many say to me, once that child is born, my life counts for nothing. You know, my life, I'll give it up in a heartbeat for this child. And it's true. That's how parents feel. That's why it's so, there's so much longing, you know, to bring this child to true happiness, to the security of being a disciple. But it's their own destiny, but never underestimate the power of the selfless prayer of someone who deeply loves and loves God. So, anyway, there we have it. So, now, the next one was written back in 1976. The question is, can separation, can divorce be a good thing? Swami writes, Master said that there are times when it is right and necessary to separate from your spouse. I mean, that's just a simple statement in itself, because there are teachings that say that separation in marriage is never justified. Master said there are times when it is. Just as simple as that, which is a much more sensible answer, because there are times when it is. Some relationships are untenable, and many are just simply not helpful. At this point, at this time, Swami writes, I think this separation may be good for you. Through your meditations, you will be able to understand further yourself what is best to do. Being alone will also give you more time to meditate and gain a clearer perspective on the whole situation. My prayers and blessings are with you always in Master's love. I have no idea in 1976 what the situation was. Swami just says, there are times, and to me this seems like one of those times. But then Swami also offers back to him or her, you'll have time to meditate, and you should meditate, and then you'll know for yourself what is right to do. So all he's saying is he's giving whoever this is divine permission to separate. Permission divine, because Master condones it in principle, and Swami supports it in this instant. But then he steps back, because Swami, one, it was his policy never to interfere in people's personal life, nor does he want someone to say, oh, I would have gone back to my spouse, but Swami told me not to. I mean, that's just, you can't live like that. You can say, Swami confirmed what I felt. I was inclined this way, and I was supported by what Swami said to me. I was comforted by what Swami said to me. Swami said to me that Master said there are times when separation is necessary. But to say, I'm leaving my spouse because Swami said I should, that's not wholesome. And Swami was very, very careful in that respect. He basically spoke of only 2 times when he ever told someone what to do. One of them resulted in the Bertolucci lawsuit, when he told the other woman that was trying to break up a marriage where the husband wanted to stay with his wife, and the other woman, who was Bertolucci, the woman named Bertolucci, insisted that she was going to stay in the community and she was going to get the husband for herself. And Swami said, you will not, you will move away. And the other time was when a man in the community got this woman pregnant, and the woman was she had some slight brain damage, so she wasn't entirely a fully functioned person. He got her pregnant, and he was just going to leave her. He said, you will not. You will marry her, and you will take care of that child. He said those are the only 2 times in his life he ever told people what to do. So, there you have it. And the man that he told had to take care of the child he'd conceived became an absolute enemy of Swamiji, and for years afterward wrote scathing things on the internet, probably still does, scathing things on the internet about how horrible Swami was, how immoral, how everything. And the other woman sued him. So he said only twice he's done it. It didn't work out so well, but he said he would, of course, never hesitate to do it again, because that was correct. But in a situation like this, it just would be improper. It would be a misuse of his authority. Swami was exceedingly conscious of the power is one of the 3 delusions. It's generally described as money. People talk about sex, wine, and money. I mean, that's kind of the how do you say that? The plain way of stating those things. It's more complicated than sex, wine, and money, but that's a way to get it across. But money isn't a thing in itself. Money is important because it gives you power. So the real temptation is power. And how do you get it, and how do you wield it? This came up interestingly when we were in Israel, and we had actually just gone to the Holocaust Museum, Vad Shem, I think it's called, in Jerusalem. Forgive me if I've mispronounced that Hebrew name, which is, I have to say just from the beginning, just in terms of an extraordinary, piece of art for the purpose that it's meant to convey. From the architecture of the building to the displays, absolutely everything about it, the Holocaust Museum there, is just a magnificent piece of work. They had the people, and it was many, who decided that they were going to present that period of history in Jerusalem for people to understand. It just couldn't be, they couldn't have done it better. It's exceedingly refined in its presentation. It's very clear. It's aesthetic, but it's stark. It's frank, but it's not sensational. I really can't say enough about it, just creatively and artistically. It's really an inspired piece of work. And of course it's incomprehensible, except it's right there in front of you. That 6 million people would have just been swept up in modern times by civilized society and eliminated, killed. So what was the point that I was going to make about that? Oh yes, so as a consequence, this was part of our spiritual pilgrimage, and it was an optional trip. We just sort of said, for some people, it's worth seeing, and it's worth seeing, but some people want to see it, some don't. So then just the question of persecution and suffering and bigotry and racial hatred and martyrdom, just all of these things, of course, they just go around and around and around. And being from a Jewish family, just these are questions that I've asked. And I tried to think it out, like, what is this on a more cosmic level? Because the Jewish tradition says that you have a Jewish soul, meaning that a Jew is a special creation and is just always a Jew. The principle of reincarnation does not agree with that. It's quite possible that you would have an affinity for a particular religion or culture or anything like that. One might reincarnate in the same place many times. Many families seem to be continuous reincarnations of each other. Sometimes you'll sort of get part of a family, and then you'll become, your grandmother's. You'll become your grandmother's, your grandfather. Let me see how to say this. You'll become your own great-grandfather, or you'll become your child and you are your own great-grandfather. I was trying to get something that works like that, but you understand it. You're just not finished. You just keep coming. The relationships continue, either out of hatred, negativity, or hopefully out of love. Hatred is also a very powerful key. But the reality of it is, as I understand it, we're in the astral world, and in one form or another, depending on how self-aware we are and who you talk to, somehow or another, the compelling need to take another physical body arises. Your astral karma runs out, your material karma begins to activate. Sometimes I joke about it. Maybe you desperately wanted to marry George, but Hilda got in there and married him instead of you, and you're in the astral world and you notice that George is reincarnated, and you're afraid that Hilda's going to get there first, so you rush in so that you can be George's next door neighbor so that Hilda won't get him. I mean, those are the kinds of things that can happen. Strong desires, strong intensities, or just restlessness. I use the example whenever we talk about it, like, you can be home, you're going to spend the evening at home. I'm still in relative speaking restricted quarters in September 2020, but let's assume that life was more normal. I'm going to set aside an evening, I'm going to have a long sadhana, I'm going to read a spiritual book, I'm going to learn some new chants, all these things I'm going to do. But after an hour or so, I get a little restless, and maybe I'm hungry, but maybe there's nothing really good in the fridge, and I think I'll just slip out and get a pizza. And so I slip out to get a pizza, and when I get to the pizza place, I meet a couple of friends. I was going to take my pizza home, but they're sitting down. Why don't you sit down with us? Then we sit down and we talk, and we begin to have a really good time, and then there's a nice movie. I come in at midnight, and I see my harmonium and my meditation seat, and it was like, oh yeah, that's what I was going to do. So we're in the astral world. The astral world is beautiful. We're manifesting mangoes with our thoughts, we're just doing whatever we want to do. But then this just kind of hankering for a pizza comes up. And we just peek over the edge of the pink cloud, and suddenly, bingo, we find ourselves in another body. But in a much more serious way of thinking about it, we have a karmic pattern in the chakras, and we're on our way to God realization, because everybody's on their way to God realization. And we're going to have to work out, we're going to have to come to a true understanding of the nature of delusion and the nature of enlightenment. And somewhere in the process of that, we're going to have to face into and sort out over sensuality, commitment to the body as the one reality, which is what sex represents, indulgence in all the pleasures of the physical pleasures. Wine represents the thought that if I can, the more unconscious I am, the happier I'll be, intoxicants. And then money represents power. And if you have a lot of money, money can seemingly bring with it a lot of power. I've been amused to see how often when people have money, they become so bossy. Just like because they have money, they think they get to make all the decisions. I was in a complex situation with people who had money, and I was so amused by how peremptory they were. And it was just, they were so peremptory because they had the money. I can't think of any other reason why. But you get in the habit of that. I'm going to call the shots because I'm paying for this. I'm paying for this, and I'm going to call the shots. I mean, speaking of parents and children, that's what happens. Money gives you power, but it's power. It's having it, not having it. It's being a victim because I don't have power and other people oppress me. Or I have the opportunity for power and I misuse it. And then I get to be oppressed because I misuse my power, and now I get to be oppressed. Now, I'm not going to take this all the way to Jerusalem and all the way to the Holocaust Museum because it's way too complex. Just way too complex. But it is something that has to be sorted out. And all this began from Swamiji. Swamiji, for many incarnations, he's been a king. He's had the position of power, spiritual power, worldly power, and he's very, very conscious and careful about it. And when people were suing him and suing us and accusing him of all these abuses of power, using it to get women for himself, using it to get money for himself, using it just to oppress people for the joy of oppressing them. And he just said, and it was true, because the people pressing the suit were very low consciousness people. And when they couldn't prove when they really couldn't prove these accusations, they just thought Swami was just too clever to get caught. And Swami said, because if they were in my position, this is what they would do. And they literally can't imagine even the idea that someone would not take advantage of a position of power, which is what they see that I have. But Swamiji, the lesson of power was long since learned. So in all the years of Ananda and all the thousands of people that went through, he pulled up 2 instances where he ever actually said, you will do this. He said to that man, you will marry that girl, and you will take care of her child. And then to the other woman, he said, you will leave this community and you will not break up that marriage. And she did leave, and she did not break up that marriage. She took her revenge, and so did the other man take his revenge. But you see that the lesson is learned then. Just like, I don't need to do this. This is not my reality. So, in this case, this was such a simple case, Swami said, here's the principle. Master said you may, but when you have more time, you'll be able to reflect as to what you should do, and you'll see the situation differently. But that's as far as Swami would go. He used his authority to speak for Master, because that wasn't an abuse of his power. That was actually an appropriate expression of it. You know, Swami was with Master. Swami knew what Master said, and I've talked about it through these letters and other places. You can't just read the written word and know what is really the truth. That's why we have to have living instruments. So it was Swami's responsibility. The power that had been given to him was to express, was to clarify and make sure we understood Master's teaching. So he presented that. But then after that, he would support the man or the woman, but they had to figure it out for themselves. These are very important lessons for leadership, for life, for parenting, which is where we started, and for marriage too, for that matter. Okay, the last one in this section is called Going Beyond Human Love. That seems like a nice ending, doesn't it? This is in January of 2003. Oh dear, but it's not very it's not very happily ever after. That's what it isn't. Dear whoever, God doesn't treat those who love him in quite the same soft way he treats others, more softly than many of them realize. And now he's not speaking of devotees, he's speaking of those who are still playing in the world, that God sometimes treats people more softly than they realize. I mean, I don't know exactly what that means yet, but we'll see. For instance, the devotee may wonder, why can't I too have the human love that others seem to have? But God may take that normal fulfillment away from devotees while giving it to others. Why? Because he wants them to go deeper and to love him alone. Turn more to him. Don't ask for anything else. He will give you what you need and when you need it. One of the things that happens on the spiritual path, we have to go back in this to talk about the four castes. And the four castes, the tradition of the four castes, C-A-S-T-E-S, not the predictions, the numeral 4 and the word caste. The concept of the caste came actually from a very high age. And it was a way of understanding people's progression on the spiritual path. And in an enlightened society, where intuition and wisdom were the guiding forces, an understanding of where one stood in the progression from delusion to enlightenment could allow one to make appropriate choices about vocation, about where one should live, about the kind of art you should pursue, the friends that you should have, the marriage you should have, how to raise your family. Because if you had priests and astrologers and high-minded friends and advisors and family, you would all work together for your own welfare, your own well-being. And so you wouldn't be caught in a situation that would either be impossible for you to succeed at, would be too simplistic to actually develop your talents, would put you in harm's way because the temptations involved might be too great. You know, just all the things that might happen if we actually lived in an enlightened society, which we don't live in an enlightened society. And it was not hereditary. The caste system was not hereditary. It was a way of understanding character, a way of describing character. So the four castes was the Shudra, the Vaishya, the Kshatriya, and the Brahmin. Shudra means peasant, and these are archetypes, because especially nowadays when everything's so mixed up, it doesn't really mean anything. But these are archetypes. A peasant works with his physical body. That's, he's a laborer. And physical work is the right work for such a person because they don't have a highly developed mental capacity. So if they try to do mental work, one, they can't succeed, and two, they wouldn't know how to put out energy through the mind. They know how to put energy through the body. So they put out energy through the body, and in the act of putting out energy and doing good work using primarily physical force, they develop. and they develop an awareness of mental possibilities, and their mind begins to develop. Now, there's all kinds of qualities here, but the Shudra quality of the peasant is that the only motivation for action is the threat of punishment, because there's a strong draw toward low consciousness, that pleasure is downward, sleep and sex primarily, and the only reason that we put out energy is because otherwise we'll be punished. We won't be able to pay the rent, we won't be able to eat, or my master will punish me in one way or another, my whoever's my boss. But once we start putting out energy, we begin to enjoy what it feels like to put out energy, and we begin to think more creatively about what we're doing. Shudras are, for the most part, not creative, but when they start putting out energy, they begin to realize, well, I could do this better. And if I do it better, it comes out better. And if it comes out better, I suddenly get praised for what I'm doing, and I suddenly have satisfaction. And motivation shifts from fear of punishment to the satisfaction of getting something for myself. And then we move up into the Vaishya level. And on the Vaishya level, we become mentally clever. We don't just work with our bodies, we work cleverly with our minds. And our motivation for action is, what's in it for me? And as long as there's something in it for me, I'll put out energy. Because I've learned from being a Shudra that when I can get more for myself, I feel good, right? And so the Vaishya begins to work, and he gets a lot for himself. And then he accidentally discovers, as he's getting things for himself, that it's also kind of fun to give things to people. I had a friend of mine once gave me a very expensive gift because he was capable of doing so. He was in a certain business, and it gave him the possibility to give me something I needed that was very valuable, and it was a very nice thing for him to do. And he said to me, and I kept a straight face, "Gee, it feels good to give things away. Maybe I'll think about giving other things away." And I thought to myself, yeah. He was very well-to-do and very successful in his business, but it was just occurring to him that he could give things away. Swamiji sat at the dinner table with his family once and said Swami's family moved in a fairly high echelon of society. They were fairly well-to-do. They weren't wealthy, but they were well-to-do. And Swami remarked, he said, it's just so remarkable to him that people can earn so much money and just spend it on themselves. Swami just said that, like, how could they? And his mother said, and his mother was a very spiritual person, now that's an unusual way to think about it. And afterwards, Swami said to some of us, how else would you think about it? But the Vaishya is motivated because I get more and more for myself. A bigger house, a bigger car, 2 boats instead of 1, a $10,000 handbag, just like, I see sometimes, I had a friend who was very conscious of brands and things like that. She would say, that's a $500 pair of boots that woman is wearing, and I think $500, like, why would, and I just like, it doesn't attract me because I've been there and I've done that. I'm sure that I've been there and I've done that. But you start using your mind, you start acquiring for yourself, and then accidentally you start being generous, and then you discover that generosity is even really much more fun, and then you begin to move into the realm of self-sacrifice. But it doesn't feel like sacrifice, it's just, it makes me happier to work for others and to give away than it does to please myself. So we come up to the Kshatriya level, and the Vaishya, the archetype is merchant, because a merchant, an honest merchant, he'll give you a good product for a good price. He won't steal from you, but I'm not going to give it away. I need my profit too. But then all of a sudden, idealism becomes much more enjoyable than profit. So then we become Kshatriya. And the archetype of a Kshatriya, the soldier, because the soldier is so committed to his ideals that he will discipline himself and even sacrifice his life for the sake of what he believes in. And, it's not a political statement, it's a state of mind, of nobility and selflessness in order for this to protect others for an ideal we believe in. And also the king. Nowadays, most of our leaders are Shudras or Vaishyas. They're either just complete impossible, or they'll only do it for themselves. The idea of actually having a Kshatriya as a ruler is pretty rare. But the ideal of a king is that he's the servant of his country, and his wishes come last and everyone's welfare comes first. You know, in the political debate that's going on in our country right now, that's what the debate is about. You know, is the leader choosing himself, or is the leader choosing the country? That's the accusation that's put toward him. And that's what has to be determined by the voters. Okay, and then the last is, first we do it for ideals, the kshatriya, and then the kshatriya realizes that the only ideal worth acting upon is the will of God. And then we become the Brahmin, and the ideal of the Brahmin is the priest, where we live only for God. Now, it was not hereditary when it started. So you were a priest if you really were a priest, not because your father and your grandfather was a priest. And you were a king because you really were a king, not because your father and the grandfather were the king. Now, that's in a perfect society, which we don't live in. So the whole reason to talk about all of this is that as devotees, now let me also say, nobody is purely one of these, unless you're completely enlightened. But we're a mixture. And in different circumstances, we're different ones of them. You know, there are things we only do because of fear of punishment. It's just, you know, we don't eat the whole gallon of ice cream because the punishment would be that our body would get sick or our body would outgrow its clothes, whatever it might. And that's a kind of punishment. Otherwise, we would eat the whole ice cream. So there's times when there's no ideal involved, there's just fear of punishment. And then there's things that we'll do just because there's something in it for me. You know, if I really put out this energy, then something I want will come to me. And that's, you know, that's who we are at certain times. And actually, the truth is, you kind of work with yourself. Sometimes if you can't motivate yourself for any other reason, then you promise yourself a reward. When I finish this, I will get this, and then you're motivated to do it. But as devotees, and the issue as devotees is this Vaishya Kshatriya place right here, which is, it's only natural. You do that which gives you joy. So it's not a question of whether you do it to suffer or you do it for joy. You do it for joy. But the question is, what causes my happiness? What gives me joy? Is it selfish gain, or is it the satisfaction of doing the right thing? Or the satisfaction of pleasing God? Because joy is the motivation all the way through. We want to avoid suffering, we want to experience joy. But what gives us joy? So when we get caught between the Vaishya and the Kshatriya, we start on the spiritual path because, you know, I'm going to live in attunement with God and I'm going to love God. And God will bless me if I love Him. God loves me. I'm His child. Everything that belongs to my Father belongs to me. And we get all these affirmations and, you know, I go forth in perfect faith in the power of omnipresent good to give me what I need at the time I need it. And we're so proud of ourselves. But the problem is sometimes what we think of as good is not what God thinks of as good. So we get caught and we don't realize that we have been actually acting. We've been devotees, we've been sincere, we've been working hard, but an underlying attitude was the one of Vaishya. Lord, I've given you so many kriyas. I've been tithing for all these years, you know, and now my house is burned down in this fire. How dare you? How dare you burn down my house after all the kriyas I've done for you? And you don't necessarily, you've never thought about it like that. But somewhere deep inside, there was that attitude. Ramakrishna, there's a story in the Gospel of Ramakrishna where this man comes and he talks to Ramakrishna about all the money he's given to the temple and all the things he's done to help the priests. And he just sort of goes on and on for this period of time. And Ramakrishna finally sort of leans over and he said, I wonder how God managed before you were born. And the man apparently had the good grace, as the story is told, to be embarrassed and to realize that he was receiving a necessary corrective. The way I think about it is we subconsciously have made a contract with God, and what we've laid down is our likes and dislikes. And good God, our likes and dislikes could be perfectly understandable. You know, I want my child to grow up strong. You know, I don't want to become a widow. I don't want my house to burn down. I want this, you know, all my efforts to make this business a success. I don't want my partner to turn out to be a thief who embezzles it and causes the whole thing to crash. I mean, it's not like we have bad desires necessarily. But what we think is good for us is not always what God thinks is good for us. So we go through this period, and every devotee goes through it, and often goes through it more than once, where we suddenly feel betrayed by God. You know, like, why isn't he? I used to have what I called refugees from the New Age. I don't find it so much now, but it was more in the 80s and a little bit into the 90s when there was this big explosion of a new way of thinking about spirituality. And part of the new way of thinking is that, you know, that we don't have to suffer. We don't have to be poor. We can have it all. We can just have it all. We can be healthy. We can be rich. We can have wonderful relationships. We can have it all. And then you have these affirmations and these attitudes and these testimonials about how we have it all, and we're just doing this. And forgive me, there's a lot of truth in this and it's helpful, but I have seen it exaggerated. And then people would come to me, especially then, and they would feel like complete failures because they were following all these rules. And I still have asthma. I can't seem to cure my asthma. I still want to be married, and I'm not married. I wanted my spouse, you know, to give up their adulterous affair, and they won't. You know, just whatever it might be. I prayed that my mother, you know, be recovered from cancer, and she died. And I did everything I was supposed to do. And I would have to explain that the teaching is fatally flawed because it doesn't take into account the possibility that God knows better than you what's good for you. This is precisely the example of how to pray given by Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, Lord, let this cup pass from me. I'm here to bring these people to enlightenment and to joy, and they are about to reject me in a most horrible way. Jesus wasn't personal about it. The loss or the keeping of his body was of no consequence to him. He was a self-realized master. But he'd come with this great gift, and they were about to throw it in the dust and trample on it. He said, Lord, do something else, but thy will, not mine, be done. Now this is the honest prayer. And being honest with God is extremely important. We can't just pretend. He reads the heart. He doesn't hear all these words. We spin all these stories out and it all sounds so clever. He knows the vibration of the heart. Who am I really? What am I really in my heart? And if I'm deeply attached and I have a deep desire for something, if I want my child to be cured, of course I want my child to be cured. But somewhere along the line, we have to realize that what I really want to live by is principle. And the principle that I've begun to understand as a kshatriya is that I live for God, is where we really come to. That there is a higher reality than my preference and my comfort. And that I'm not doing it for what I get. This is what I'm trying to say. I'm not on the spiritual path for what I get. I'm on the spiritual path because I believe that it's true. And where else could I go? And it's tricky because bad things happen. Swamiji says, and he says it with great power, that God protects us from outright catastrophe, but he doesn't protect us from necessary karma. And so when that necessary karma hits, we get to find out, am I a Vaishya? Am I doing this because I get what I want? Or am I a Kshatriya? I'm doing this because it's true, and where else could I go? And that's a huge shift. And so, everybody around me, all these worldly people seem to have these lovely little lives, and I don't, And he's talking specifically about human love. All my friends seem happily married. They're out there having their lives, and here I am in this ashram having given my life to God, and I'm dying of loneliness. Why is that? Hard to answer that question, except what are you going to do about that? Sometimes when people ask, why does a particular test come to us? Sometimes you have to ask, what reaction is it bringing out in me? Is this disappointment sufficient for me to go back to the world and try to find comfort in those things which I know are not going to comfort me? Or am I going to stick with my ideals, regardless of what it costs me? You see, that's the ideal of the soldier. The soldier is out there in extremely difficult conditions. He's seen some of his friends die. He may know that he's going to die, but he has committed himself to this course of action. He knows why he's doing it. He knows that his sacrifice is for a good cause, and he's not going to turn back, even if it costs him his life. That's what God wants from us, much more. One life is nothing. Will I, in the midst of everything, will I continue to trust my own understanding of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it? We call it faith in God, but Swamiji and Master were very interesting about it. The faith that's really being tested is the faith in my own understanding of why I'm committed to this path. Am I committed in this path because I get to have what I want? Or am I committed to this path because it's the right thing to do? It's just I have to work on my consciousness. I have to work for high ideals. I have to be faithful to Dharma. I must be faithful to truth. And I understand this is Dharma, this is the truth. So it just sort of doesn't matter what else is or isn't happening. I have no choice. That's just what it is. So Swami says, God just doesn't always fulfill our lives. Sometimes he just lets worldly people have whatever they want because they're not even thinking about it yet. Is this easy? No. Do we have a choice? Well, that's up to you to decide. And that's why those tests come, so that we'll find out who we really are. So, thus ends marriage and renunciation. And now, we don't get a respite, although the first letter is not as hard as some of them that come. So we're going to start with the first letter here. We're not going to get through it because it's a little too long and a little too complicated, but we'll start. And this section is called Strong Medicine. I was involved in the organization of this book, and there was just a group of letters, and I was working with Naidruva, who was the editor of this book, who really did all the work. I was just holding her hand to help just make it easier to figure out what to do once she had these 250 letters, how to organize them. And the phrase strong medicine, I think it came from her, I don't remember. But it's, sort of like we looked at some of these letters and it was like, whoa, these letters are strong medicine. Yeah, they're strong medicine. They're medicine, but Swami doesn't mince words. So it's a whole very interesting series. Let me see where I am. Okay. So the first letter, which we won't get through, but I'll start, it's from October 1998. And I have to give context to it. Swami refers to the context, but you really have to understand. I'm looking back here, but the book I'm going to refer to isn't on the shelf there. Let's see. In 1968, no, it wouldn't have been 60, it would have been 1962. When Swami was living in India, and he was a representative Self-Realization Fellowship, but his relationship with SRF had really begun to disintegrate, super disintegrate. He had had some very bold plans for Master's work in India, and he was completely out of step with the rest of the board of directors, and shortly after that he was expelled. And just before he was expelled, he read an article in a magazine published by the American Diplomatic Service or something. It was a U.S. publication, a government publication, and it was all about the meaninglessness of life, about how philosophers are coming up with these ideas about the meaninglessness of life. I believe I have this all correct. And Swamiji thought, those same philosophical ideas, if you view them from the point of view of Master's teachings, there's an entirely different conclusion that can be drawn. And he had this impulse within him to write a book to answer a lot of this negative philosophy that was becoming so popular. Jung, Sartre, others that just emphasized the downward pulling energy. And he thought, because he was still part of SRS, he would never have an opportunity to write the book, and the book would never be published anyway, because they were decades away from publishing Master's manuscripts. Shortly after, Swami was expelled from SRF and suddenly found himself on his own, able to do whatever he wanted. So it occurred to him that Master had been hinting to him by that thought to write the book, and he started working on the book. It actually took him 10 years. He didn't finish it until 1972. And he researched very deeply all of this Western philosophy, and then he wrote a book which is now called Out of the Labyrinth. At that time he called it Crises in Modern Thought. And he talked about these various philosophers and how you could reinterpret their teachings to come up with a much more life-affirming conclusion. Now, that book, he said, was intended to be the introduction to another book, and the other book was going to show how all religious traditions were the same. It was to prove Master's point that self-realization has come to unite all religions. That the principle of self-realization, not any institution with that name, but the principle of self-realization that all sentient beings are moving from delusion to enlightenment. And that's the way we're made, and that all of life is designed to move us toward enlightenment. And every true spiritual tradition is teaching self-realization in one form or another. And there is what he called the outward way of belief, and then there is the inward way of awakening. I'm not sure he had those words in 1962 or 72, but that was what he was thinking. And he was just going to skim over Western philosophy, get it out of the way, and then he was going to write about the unity of all religions. But it took him 10 years to write a book, and it took him the whole book to deal with Western philosophy. But then, let's see, this would have been 1998, in the late 90s. Oh yes, this was like this. Swamiji, this was after the major lawsuit was over, after the Bertolucci lawsuit was over, and it looked like the SRF lawsuit was over. The SRF lawsuit was like the many-headed hydra. Every time we would cut it off and think it was over, it would start over again. But it went into an appeal, which eventually came back in 2001, and we had to go back into it for another year. But at this point, it looked like it was all pretty much over. And Swamiji left America and went to live in Europe at that point. He went to live in Europe partly because he was just tired of what was going on in America. He was very, we all were. We were very displeased with the American justice system. We were very displeased with a whole lot of things that were going on here. But there was also something much more important. Swamiji felt that even though Ananda was a very important part of the commission that he'd been given from Master, it did not define that commission. He felt that he had a far broader message to deliver to the world, and that his living in close proximity within Ananda, especially at Ananda village, was too confining. He needed to be freer of all influences in order to really feel what God was wanting him to do. And he talked about specifically the way his house was set up, the way his house remained, is at Ananda village at Crystal Hermitage. Crystal Hermitage is the garden and the expanded community center that Swami created with the money he inherited from his father. As he said at the time, my father never gave a dime to Ananda. And he said, I feel his soul would not be at peace if I took his hard-earned money and just gave it to Ananda. He said, and my soul would not be at peace if I didn't. So he felt in a dilemma. So what he did was he used that money to take what, it wasn't called Crystal Hermitage. At that time, it was just his house, basically. And he greatly expanded it so that it became a community center. And he built these beautiful gardens, which still are there and are absolutely lovely. And in the end, he actually ran out of money, and the community built for him a small apartment at an underneath level. The whole house is built on a steep cliff, so the apartment is at a lower level than the main house and a lower level than the garden, but it's not under it. It's just down from it, so that the garden level is the roof level for the apartment, meaning there's a lot of privacy, and he has a beautiful view out the side. At the same time, it's right there. The community center is literally right on top of it. And psychically, it's just right in the middle of Ananda. And so Swamiji really felt he needed complete psychic freedom in order to feel what Master wanted him to do next. So he moved to Italy, but he did not live in the community the way he lived in the community at the village. And also, the way Ananda Sisi had developed, Swami had never been in residence there except occasionally. So it never built up around his authority the way Ananda Village did. And even though many people at Ananda Village took tremendous responsibility, there was still the habit of asking Swami, whereas in Italy that habit had never grown up. They respected his opinion, they consulted him, but he hadn't built it himself. And so he built it through others, but there was just a different relationship. So he got property a few kilometers up the road, very isolated, in itself isolated. And he put a small house there. So it was a brand new house, everything in it was new. He said it was just a completely clean vibration. And it gave him the opportunity to say simply, Divine Mother, what do you want me to do? And then he wrote the book that he ended up calling The Hindu Way of Awakening. And The Hindu Way of Awakening was the book he planned to write in 1962, in which he talked about self-realization as the unifying reality behind all religions. But he used Hinduism as the example, because he was making the distinction, as I said a moment ago, between the way of belief, which is all the outer rituals and the dogmas and the different ways that people approach things, versus the way of awakening. He said the way of belief is every religion has their own way. He said, and if you ever try to make unity out of the way of belief, he said all that happens is that people tolerate each other, because you cannot unify them on that level. I mentioned earlier this evening that it's a Jewish belief, I've been told, that there is such a thing as a Jewish soul, but that's not consistent with what Sanatana Dharma teaches, where we move in and out of all these different realities. So, a self-realizationist and a Jewish person, not a self-realizationist, but say a Hindu, and a Jewish person will just simply, they can respect each other, but they cannot meet. But if we can go to the way of awakening, and we can talk about how consciousness expands and how compassion builds in the heart, and how we live from the higher chakras, and how our eyes are drawn upward. I mean, the Jewish Psalm of David, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. Why do we lift up our eyes unto the hills? Because that's what we're doing. That's the same teaching. And it's the way of awakening where unity can be achieved. And this is like moving a vast step forward from just ecumenical gatherings, where the priest says to the rabbi, and the rabbi says to the imam, and the imam says to the pujari, and everybody loves each other, but nobody actually really believes each other. He's just trying to move it to a whole nother level. So he brought this book out in this year, and then he received this letter from this individual in the community who thought, oh, I'm so excited about this. Let's have a festival. Let's have a festival of theater. Let's have a theater festival in which all the different religions bring plays about their religion, and then we'll fulfill what you're trying to fulfill. And Swami says, no, no, no. And that's the background, which you will have to remember, because next week we'll read the letter. Okay, my friends. God bless you.